Most foreigners learning Chinese rely on textbooks written specifically for foreigners. But what about textbooks written for native speakers? Can't we use those to learn Chinese too? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about textbooks, and not just any old textbook, but we're going to talk about using textbooks written for native speakers. And to be clear here, I mean textbooks in Chinese, so about the Chinese language written for native speakers. And this would be akin to Americans learning English in school or Swedish people studying Swedish. And these textbooks are of course available and used, and Chinese people spend a lot of time learning about their own language in school. So the question then is, can we as foreigners use these books to learn Chinese? What are the pros? What are the cons? The reason I bring this up today is because on Hacking Chinese I have just published an article written by John Renfro over at Outlier Linguistics, where he introduces how to learn classical Chinese. And this is something that is covered in textbooks for native speakers. That's part of what they're learning when they are learning Chinese. It's not everything, of course, but it's an important part. I will get back to this point later in this episode, but if you want to learn specifically about classical Chinese, I've put a link in the description to John's article. So let's get started by talking about textbooks, and now I mean textbooks in general, including for foreigners. Well, first and foremost, I do think that textbooks are quite useful. They provide level-adjusted content, they are carefully curated and so on, and that is very useful, especially for beginners, as this can be hard to find elsewhere. Of course, you shouldn't read only your textbook, you should spend most of your time reading other things at or below your level. So this is a type of extensive reading, which we talked about in episode 16, so I will not talk that much about it here. But the point is that you should diversify your reading, and this becomes increasingly true the more advanced your Chinese is, and then native textbooks might look like an area worth exploring. So let's do that. And since I don't want to clarify all the time that I mean Chinese language textbooks for native speakers, I will use the terms in Chinese, which would be Yuwen in mainland China and then Guowen in Taiwan. And of course, this is a subject that's being studied all the way through school, but I'm mostly referring to books for high school here, so that would be age 12 to age 18. And naturally, the textbooks get harder the older the students are. So what are the biggest pros of using these textbooks as a second language learner? Well, one important advantage is that this is an introduction to written Chinese with help and exercises. Because if you think about it, kids aged 12, they of course know how to speak the language very well, but they haven't had that much experience with the written formal language. And if that's the case for you as well, then these textbooks can serve as a good introduction to a more formal language. And this includes things like introduction to how punctuation is used, or various ways of doing things in formal Chinese that you might not have learned from your everyday conversations. And there are usually exercises that go with this, and you can learn a lot by studying what they are learning about formal Chinese. The second, and in my opinion probably the most important advantage, is that this is a great way of learning about culture, and this is especially true for literature, because in these textbooks kids learn about their own culture, they learn about literature, they learn about the authors who wrote these texts, and so on. And these are the things that native speaker adults will know, but you as a foreigner probably don't know. So studying what they are learning in school gives you an idea of what they know, which will help you interpret other texts that you read elsewhere. It can also be rather hard as a foreigner to know which are the important authors, which are the important books that most people have read at least excerpts from. But if you go through these Yuwen textbooks, you will get a good grasp of what kids are learning in school, which of course varies over time, so it's not the case that kids today learn exactly the same texts as adults learned when they were in school, but some of them stay the same, and generally speaking, it is a good idea to get a grasp of what people think is important. Another advantage of using Yuwen textbooks is that it gives you a glimpse of what it's like for them. And this is of course also related to culture. If you don't know what it's like to grow up in China, can you really understand a Chinese person? And of course, going to school is not the same as reading a few textbooks, but at least you can get a glimpse of what they are going through when they are learning Chinese as kids. I also find it interesting as an adult and as a teacher to see how these textbooks teach certain things related to language and culture. And this also maybe can help us understand Chinese culture better. The next advantage is the one I mentioned at the very beginning, baby steps to classical Chinese. So UN textbooks always contain a lot of classical Chinese. Of course, how much depends exactly on what textbook it is and so on, but maybe say a fifth or a quarter maybe of the textbook covers classical Chinese in various forms, and this can be everything from short poems that they are supposed to memorize, or analysis of, say, the Analects by Confucius or something like that. So usually excerpts from longer works or poems, and native speakers memorize a lot of these things. We in the West seldom memorize things. At least when I went to school, I memorized almost nothing, but in China this is still very common, and it's not uncommon to meet adults who can quote long passages that they learned in school. Obviously, you probably shouldn't do that, or I can find many other ways of investing time that would be more worthwhile, but at least being aware of the literature that they read and are able to quote can be useful and insightful. Of course, the texts that they memorize are often in classical Chinese, and if you're not familiar with what classical Chinese is, well, first you should check out John's article that I linked to in the description. But an easy and somewhat accurate way of thinking about it might be if you're an Italian person studying Italian in school, and maybe you have to memorize poetry in Latin, or you read some treatise in Latin. And this is of course familiar because many of the words are the same and you can recognize many things, but there are thousands of years between you and that text, and that is quite difficult, even if it is at the heart of it the same language. So what I'm saying is that these kids who read these textbooks, they are native speakers, they speak fluently, but they still think that Yuan is hard. And most Chinese people think that Yuan is difficult. And of course, that means that you probably will find it quite difficult too. But the advantage here is that these textbooks introduce these poems and texts to native speakers who don't know classical Chinese, and so they need to be introduced in modern Chinese. So there are annotations, explanations of difficult words, grammar, and so on. And this can be hugely beneficial if you want to dip your toes into classical Chinese. Then again, if you really want to learn classical Chinese, you should probably first pick up a textbook aimed at non-native speakers. Moving on to the next advantage, and this is a rather mundane one, but UN textbooks are really cheap. I just checked, and one of the most popular textbooks for foreigners, Integrated Chinese, costs around $60, whereas the Guowen series that I used only cost $7 each. Finally, and I'm not sure if this is a pro or a con, maybe it depends on your personality, but picking up one of these textbooks is a lesson in humility. Unless you've studied Chinese for a really long time and your reading ability is very good, picking up a UN textbook meant for 12-year-olds is going to be fairly difficult. And I mean difficult here as in much harder than the last textbook in any of the mainstream textbook series, and also well beyond HSK 6. I read my first Guowen textbook after studying Chinese for 2 years, and I did so mostly because it was part of the curriculum in the program I was studying. And this turned out to be too difficult. Not too difficult in the sense that I couldn't manage, because I still went through the whole book and did fairly well in the course, but I realized that I'm spending way too much time looking things up, and it was agonizingly slow. I would have been better off using easier reading material and maybe approaching this at a later point. This was a textbook aimed at junior high school, so 12-year-olds, and if you want to see excerpts from the book, I've published those in the written article on Hacking Chinese, link in the description. Before we move on to the disadvantages of using UN textbooks, I'd also like to say that many of these advantages actually are true not just for UN textbooks, but for any textbooks written for native speakers. And if you're interested in that, I've written an article called 866 Digital Textbooks for Expanding Your Chinese. And that contains a link to a resource with lots of textbooks used in Chinese schools. And this is not just UN, it's in physics, in chemistry, in history, and so on and so forth. And you can derive most of the same benefits from these books. They are actually usually easier to read because the point there is not to teach you Chinese, but to teach you a subject, and then maybe the language is a little bit easier, especially if you know the subject matter they are teaching. Okay, so let's look at the disadvantages with using UN textbooks as a second language learner. And the first one, it's an obvious one, and I've said it already, they are too difficult for most people. And this is a good example of something that is a lot harder than it seems, and you might think that picking up a textbook for a 12-year-old oughtn't be that hard, but unless you have tried, like I said, it is quite difficult. If you're interested in hearing me talk about other things that are harder than they seem when it comes to learning Chinese, we actually talked about that in episode 32 of the podcast. The second downside of using UN textbooks is that they aren't always as useful as you wish they'd be. because they are written for native speakers and you are not a native speaker, so they will help you with some things that you maybe don't need help with and leave out other things that you really need help with, but that they leave out because, of course, native speakers don't need that help. In other words, you are not in the target group, and sometimes this becomes very obvious. Apart from that, there really aren't that many downsides of using UN textbooks, although those two are rather important. It can be rather hard to get hold of them in print depending on where you live. Obviously, if you live in an area where children go to school and learn Chinese, you can just go to a bookshop and you can buy as much as you want and it's going to be fairly cheap. But most listeners to this podcast don't do that, and so getting hold of printed books can be hard. You can already use the digital resource I suggested earlier, but otherwise it can be rather tricky to order these things online, and you're better off probably trying to find a Chinese person who can help you, maybe buy them for you and send them to you, than figuring out how to use these online bookstores, pay successfully, and wait months for the books to show up. If anyone listening to this has a suggestion for an international bookshop you can order these books from and have them sent to you internationally and pay with something that doesn't require a Chinese phone number and so on and so forth, I would very much appreciate if you headed over to the written article and left a comment or got in touch with me in some other way. And if I find bookshops where you can buy these internationally, I will put links to these in the written article. But like I said, for most people, digital reading is the way to go. So in conclusion, I've gained a lot from studying UN textbooks, not just language, but it does require a certain amount of reading ability before you even start, and it can be rather frustrating sometimes when it's assumed that you know things that you don't, or when you just realize that your Chinese isn't as good as you thought it was. Still, if you want a challenge, want to broaden your horizons and learn more about Chinese language and culture, I wholeheartedly recommend checking out UN textbooks. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.